Hello, everyone, and welcome to this ECIPE online event on Russia's war against Ukraine. My name is Fredrik Eriksson, and I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers, Anders Oslund, Elizabeth Bro, and Tengiz Bakaladze, all of whom I will introduce in a minute. We're still waiting for people to connect at Zoom and other platforms, and we're also waiting for one of our speakers to join, Elizabeth. She is ending another meeting she's speaking at and is going to join us in a couple of minutes, but we are going to start without her and then she will join us in a while. So let me start by saying that this is the first in a series of events that we will be doing on the war and its consequences for war and peace in Europe. Next Wednesday, we will have a new panel discussing different topics. Earlier today, we released a podcast conversation with Michael Bernstein, who proposed already in early February that the West should develop a credible economic deterrence against Russia that will be based on freezing the assets of the Russian central bank and the securities that make up a good part of Russia's foreign exchange reserve. In the next couple of days, there will be new papers and blogs published by us on the economic and financial actions that the West can take to isolate Russia even further. And we will also present a couple of analyses on Russia's dependency on the Western economy and how Russia's economy will be crippled by many of the sanctions that have now been introduced. All right, so end of the commercial. I'm very pleased to be joined by such a good panel that we're going to have here today with Anders, Elizabeth, and Tengiz. They're all long-standing friends. Anders is a world-leading expert on Russia and Ukraine, having advised governments in both countries and written some of the best books available on Russian economic reforms and how the country ended up as a kleptocracy. Elizabeth is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and an expert on many matters related to modern wars and hybrid warfare. She published a book earlier this year on gray zone attacks against Europe and America. And last but not least, my colleague Tengiz, who recently has joined us. Tengiz is now joining us today from Prague, but he's based in Georgia, where he for long has advised Georgian governments and presidents. He works on geopolitics and has written extensively about Russian foreign policy. He is also a professor at the Georgian Institute of Public Affairs. We're going to cover a lot of ground in this discussion, but I want us to start with Western reactions to Russia's wars. Anders, you've followed Western policies towards Russia for a long time, including sanctions that have been introduced at earlier points when Russia has invaded other countries. The sanctions packages we have seen so far have been, at least in my view, surprisingly strong and seem to aim for as much economic and financial isolation of Russia as possible. At least the notion that we can build a peaceful accommodation with Russia on the basis of mutual interdependence seems finally to have been thrown out of the window. So what do you say, Anders? Are these sanctions having an effect on the Russian economy? And what more can we do?
These sanctions are really tough. And I think that after this, there will be a completely different discussion about sanctions. We've heard for so long that sanctions don't work and all kinds of odd numbers on minimal impact have been presented while Russia's GDP has been flat from 2014 to 2020, completely stagnant. So first of all, those sanctions cost much more than understood. And now these sanctions are completely devastating. So Russia's Fortress Russia collapsed in one day. It doesn't help if you have $640 billion of reserves if you can't access the reserve. It now shows that President Putin has pursued economic folly by accumulating these large reserves at considerable cost to his nation, and then he can't even access them. So the short answer on your question, what will this do to the Russian economy, is the ruble is likely to fall by at least 50%. In 2014, the ruble also fell by 50%. And that will result in an inflation that is likely to be at least 20%. And of course, this means that Russians will be much poorer. How much will the decline in GDP? We have two precedents to look at. One is 2015, the year after the hard sanctions of 2014, and then GDP fell by 2.5%. This is far more. And I would rather expect at least 5%, which was the decline in 98. And if you look upon what has happened to the Russian capital markets, they are closed, they are frozen, they don't exist. In 2 weeks, according to Bloomberg yesterday, the Russian stocks that are traded in London, 31, basically the big companies, have fallen by 98%. During the catastrophe in 98, the stock market only fell by 94%. So I don't know if Russia can have any capital markets, bonds or stocks. It doesn't make sense for anybody to try to issue stocks or bonds at these prices. It's no financing. And it will probably stay like this, because when you have severe sanctions, you get several negative effects. First, you have a sanction risk. People are afraid that something more will be sanctioned because the sanctions are taken with executive decisions and can be changed overnight. Second, you have the financial and credit risk. There's no insurance of any kind to be gotten. So you take big financial risks if you go into such a country. We can see now BP owns what used to be $14 billion of the stocks in Rosneft, and now they can't sell it. And they can't get any for it. It has become a stranded asset. The same with the other big oil companies that are now trying to withdraw from Russia. And then the third is you get reputational risk. Because when you have serious sanctions, you normally get massive criminalization of a country, in particular its foreign trade as well, and you don't want to be involved in such things. So what we are seeing now is that the whole world is turning against Russia and closing off. I think that it was very clever to have a vote in the UN General Assembly yesterday, where Russia was left with only Belarus, Syria, North Korea, and Venezuela. These are not countries that you want to be with. Even Iran abstained, and Cuba and Nicaragua. So countries you normally would expect would support Russia. And if we go to what kind of sanctions that have been carried out now, you can say that there are three big packages. One is financial sanctions, and they have been massive. So this will take out Russia from all international finance for the foreseeable future, until Putin goes or changes policy, and he's not likely to change policy, so until he goes. And then the other package is technological sanctions, which are very much like the COCOM sanctions during the Cold War, that you need to have export license to export any kind of technology to Russia. And that has the additional effect that people don't want to export. We are now seeing that Apple refuses to sell anything to Russia and a lot of other companies, because you get a bad name. Normally you want to get goodwill through trade, and here you get bad will through trade. So why take the risk? Russia is only about 1.5% of the global economy, or was before this, before Monday, and now it might be completely different. And Then the third group that is probably discussed the most is personal sanctions. And what Putin has complained most about, that was when his close business friend from St. Petersburg, the brothers Rotenberg, Yulia Kravchuk, and Gennady Timchenko were sanctioned in 2014. He complained publicly about it at least 5 times, and he claimed that this was against human rights. It's rare that Putin takes such a word in his mouth, but it's when it's about people close to him. And now we can see that Putin can't protect even his closest people. Today, Igor Sechin, Putin's perhaps most odious assistant, had his yacht seized in France. And yesterday, Alisher Usmanov had his $600 million yacht seized by the Germans in Hamburg. And Putin can't do anything about it. So Putin looks now extremely vulnerable, that he can't protect anybody. It has not been much noticed that Putin's goddaughter was not allowed to go to the Geneva University to study because she could not get a Swiss visa. Such things, I think, hurt Putin very much, and it has been said that we can't do it, etc. The reason has been that these people have very good PR agents and very good lawyers, and if there is a political will, it's possible. So what had been missing very much is political will in Europe. And here in Washington, everybody is now surprised that Europe has acted resolutely, fast, radically, and very united. So previously in the sanctions discussion, it has been like this, that the Americans have pushed and pushed for a bit harder sanctions, and the Europeans have said, yes, but let us make an exception here and not go so fast and not so hard. Now it's the opposite. Now it is Europe that is pushing for harder sanctions and wants to move faster. So the weak spot now in the Western alliance is obviously Britain. And this is becoming, right now it looks like a problem, and it will be interesting to see what comes further on. And it's very much that the US and the EU are acting together, and I don't see any reason to believe that these sanctions will be softened anywhere. Of course, there will be certain complications, that there will be some shortages in the markets. But by and large, Russia is closed out, and it's unwise to do any business in or with Russia. The export of oil and gas and metals and other commodities are likely to continue because Russia needs the money and the world needs these raw materials. But a little else can be done until Russia has withdrawn from Ukraine.
So would you say, Anders, that sort of the bulk of the sanctions we can and should have taken, they have now been taken, or are there other measures we can also take to sort of increase the pressure even more and avoid that there are going to be different type of loopholes, which basically means that there will be a flow of foreign money going into Russia that it can use in order to prop up the banks or support this war efforts? You mentioned, for instance, oil and gas. Can we do anything there?
I think it would be very unwise to do something on oil and gas because we are now seeing the oil price right now is $113 per barrel. And I would not advise it because we saw with Iran, the price only goes up, and Russia accounts for 12% of the global production of oil. So that would very much be to shoot ourselves in the foot. The big things on the financial sanctions have been done, but there are some mopping up operations that should be undertaken. For example, the IMF and the World Bank still have offices in Moscow. And what are they doing? They are advising the Russian government how to minimize the impact of the sanctions. That's wrong. They should withdraw their offices from Moscow. Russia is one of 39 members of the FAT, Financial Action Task Force, that is the big international authority to clean up money laundering, when Moscow is a major money laundering risk in itself. So instead, Russia should be kicked out of FAT and blacklisted together with Belarus as major money laundering risks. So one needs to check these various things, and there are undoubtedly a number of organizations from which Russia should be kicked out. For example, it's a Russian who's the dean of the executive board of the IMF that discusses the key issues. These things should not be accepted, and there needs to be changes, but these issues are small, and I would avoid touching Russian exports of commodities. But for example, Russian export of weapons will probably now decline in various ways because Russia doesn't have relevant technology.
We've also seen, at least there has been some reporting suggesting that consumers may be making the choices that governments aren't doing, in a sense that the orders that come in from Russian oil has declined, and of course that has in itself an effect of pushing the world market price up for oil. So I think that may also add to sort of the broader reputational consequences that comes with sanction packages, that market actors are going to do the choices for us. Also there. You mentioned individual sanctions. Are the people that have slipped through the net more people around Putin, around the Kremlin, oligarchs that haven't been caught by sanctions yet that should be part of a sanctions program?
Yes, plenty of them. You can say that the sanctions have taken out government ministers and members of the Security Council that should be sanctioned, and also military commanders. These groups are well sanctioned now. Who's not sanctioned is exactly the oligarchs. The top oligarch around Putin, Roman Abramovich, is not sanctioned anywhere at all. And he has done Putin a lot of services. So this is an obvious example. Oleg Deripaska and Suleyman Karimov, who are the people who have been fronting for Putin, were sanctioned by the US in 2014, but they are not sanctioned in Europe and can freely travel. Vladimir Yakunin, who was sanctioned by the US, has his big pro-Putin NGO, what is it called, Dialogues of the Civilization in Berlin. This should not be allowed. He should be sanctioned by the EU and get out of Germany. And Gerhard Schröder is Putin's main agent in Europe. There's no reason not to sanction him just because he has been a German chancellor. Boris Rotenberg, who was sanctioned by the US in 2014, is a Finnish citizen and lives in Finland, and therefore the EU has not sanctioned him, while he's one of the 4 people from St. Petersburg closest to Putin. Putin's 2 daughters should be sanctioned, and their children, given that Putin has been sanctioned himself now, and rightly so, one should continue to take the rest of his family. his girlfriend, Alina Kabayeva, should be sanctioned. And we have a lot of really dubious businessmen and outright criminals around Putin. In Belarus, three of the top criminals who have organized various forms of illegal economic activities were sanctioned by the EU. The EU has been very good on Belarus sanctions, better than the US, but that should be done in Russia also. There are a number of organized criminals from St. Petersburg who are now by and large living in Spain, and they should be sanctioned as well.
Tengiz, from your point of view, looking at sanctions and looking at other measures that Europe can take in order to try to increase as much cost as possible on the Russian regime for its current atrocities in Ukraine. What springs to your mind? What do you have additional views on what Europe can do? Economic related issues, for instance.
Thank you, Frederick. The first what comes to my mind when I'm hearing about sanctions, that's much better to do now than never, but this is the step that should be taken 15 years ago. And when those things starts, even I mean before the war, and I was in Kiev a month ago, observing situations, speaking with my friends, and so on. And I remember that so many friends and colleagues from the different countries, they were asking that whether I am expecting the war, and I said yes, I'm pretty sure, because not because just because of I have seen such kind of movies regrettably many times in my life, and I have kind of feeling of deja vu of 2008, for instance, because all the indicators like Russian propaganda, even the texts and messages, they were pretty similar. Just instead of Georgia, we are Ukraine. Cyber attacks, passportization process, which is nothing but replication of the process what we had in Abkhazia and so-called South Ossetia in Tskhinwalo region. The process is what we observed in Transnistria. So all cyber attacks and so on and so on. So all was, and of course, military drills, pretty similar military drills as in 2008 we had Caucasus 2008. So all together was kind of deja vu for me. And today, speaking about the war, that this is not just against Ukraine. This is a war against the civilization. About this is not about Ukraine. This is about Europe. This is about world order, because the choice is very simple. Either we agree upon new Westphalian system and divided the world, sphere of influence, and that means that long-lasting instability and ongoing wars in Europe, or we are ready to protect our values, because all what about we are talking and dreaming, and it's about values. European Union, NATO, West, international order, that's all about values. And when we are talking about sanction, in today so many experts and my colleagues are talking about the Cold War or new Cold War, however it's never have been called. And maybe Cold War was very much called in the western part of the Europe, but never was called in the eastern part. And nations like Ukrainian or Czechs or Hungary or Baltics or Poles, Georgians, they will, and so many others, who were suffering from the Soviet occupation. They were sacrificed a lot for the European prosperity. And the problem is that this part of Europe, it's still kind of unknown part of Europe, because there are so many stereotypes, misinformations. And speaking about Russia today, speaking about Russia's aggression and drivers of Russia's aggression, it's necessary to realize two things. The first of all, this is our mistakes, our misperceptions, and also the real motives of Putin and its regime. I remember in 2000, it was exactly 2000, year of 2000, when Putin came to the power, and he said that collapse of Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe, and that caused smile and laugh among the politicians as experts. In a few years, he restored the national anthem of the Soviet Union. And when we, that time, let's say, post-Soviet countries, start to alarming about that and say that this is very dangerous, his rhetoric and everything what he's doing in Chechnya and against the civil society and against the free media, and it will yield in the very serious dictatorship, that never was taken in account. Putin's famous Munich speech in 2008, it was the clear indicator that something very dangerous will start. And 2008, Georgia, invasion in Georgia, aggression in Georgia. And then 2014, Crimea. And I mean, the Western response and the world response always was wrong, because invasion in Georgia was responded by reset politics and the new offers, new contracts like Nord Stream and others. 2014, Russia didn't pay the real price for the annexation of Crimea. And only now Russia started paying the real prices. And that's why Putin was so confident that today, after the invasion of Ukraine, he will have again some concerns, condemns, statements, maybe some minor sanctions, but not unity of the Euro-Atlantic community, not unity of Europe, and definitely he wasn't expected sanctions on Nord Stream 2, restriction on SWIFT, MasterCard, Visa, personal sanctions, and so on. This is very important, but also very important is persistent and understanding that today it's not, the stake is not just a ceasefire, because I heard a lot that it's necessary to achieve ceasefire. Yes, definitely, that's extremely important to achieve ceasefire. But ceasefire has been achieved in Georgia in 2008. And then the conflict was gradually forgotten. And since 2008, the world is witnessing creeping occupation. Day by day, Russia takes Georgian territory and exercise these hybrid technologies. So I'm afraid that today, speaking about the ceasefire, it's not enough. We should realize what we really want and how we can ensure a long-lasting peace and stability in Europe.
Thank you, Tengiz. I mean, taking the same perspective to you, Anders, you mentioned previously that sanctions were going to remain most likely until Putin is out, because Putin is not going to change, which means sanctions will remain there. There's still already a lot of talk that we need to find sort of a pathway of softening sanctions in order to help the Russian regime to crawl back and to save face. What do you make of Tengi's perspective, which is that, I mean, we need to remain in this very, very hard position until it is very clear that we have a message sent through, which is this crazy idea that started a long time ago, trying to reclaim Russian control over sovereign nations that either were part of the Soviet Union or that it controlled sort of in an imperial idea of what Russia constitutes, that Putin is going to go after it as long as he can and as long as he's allowed to. So will our sanctions policy have to remain until there really is a strong change in the Kremlin?
Yes. That's the short answer.
Good.
I completely agree with what Tengi said, and I think this is really central. That Putin has seen the West talking, sanctions from hell. Now they will get, and he sees that nothing comes really out of it. So Putin, I think, as Tengi suggested, was completely confident. These useless characters cannot possibly do anything. So why should I even bother to listen to them? And he doesn't. So if we go back, 2008, there should have been serious sanctions because of the attack on Georgia. And here it was a complete confusion on the Western side. Was it the Georgians who have started it or not? It should have been sorted out properly. But perhaps not all that much, but serious sanctions should have been imposed on Russia for that. Then moving to 2014, there's sanctions of July, those financial sanctions were serious, but not enough. And then there was so much talk for years, will the European Union maintain the sanctions? Of course they did. Because sanctions are very inert. If you have managed to agree on sanctions, they stick. If there's not an improvement, and there was, of course, no improvement at all, but they were essentially unchanged until now. So therefore, they had a little credibility. Putin could say, I can do whatever I want. I think in hindsight, that the West did so little about Syria appears a terrible mistake. Because in Syria, the Russians indulge in terror bombings of hospitals and ambulances, all the things that we are now seeing in Ukraine starting. And Europeans see it when it is in Europe. They didn't see it, didn't complain much when it was in Syria. So we have to tighten. And Putin has been in power for 22 years. He has been used to the idea, I do what I want. And if there is a problem, I can buy that specific person. And that might even be legal, as in the case of Gerhard Schröder. So it really has to be a much tougher attitude. What Putin did now in December was that he presented a number of ultimata to the West, and he has shown no sign whatsoever to retreat at all. And what Putin, Lavrov, Peskov do all the time is that they lie all the time. So the saying has developed, don't believe anything until the Kremlin has denied it. And this is really where we are. So I think that the West should say, stop, we don't talk to, expel all these Soviet embassies. I said Soviet intentionally. And but if you are not serious about diplomacy, you shouldn't be in that business. And then we can pursue another business. So I was really heartened to see how Chancellor Olaf Scholz completely changed the German foreign policy instantly. And this was really remarkable. This is what I would have liked to see long ago, and I would expect that Sweden and Finland now join NATO. It would be rather strange if they don't. Right now, it's Finland that is leading, Previously, it was Sweden that was more inclined, but it's only the social democratic leadership in Sweden that need to change. And then Sweden and Finland are ready to join. So what I'm seeing is that Europe is waking up. I'm just reading Churchill's The Gathering Storm, his book about the interwar period, and he calls the years 1931 to 35 the locust years, when the West didn't do, Europe didn't do anything to stand up to Hitler. We have been there. We have just gone through the locust years. Now they are over. Now we are seeing that Europe all of a sudden is becoming serious again. And talk to Putin? No, not really. I think that Putin has gone full Hitler. Who talk seriously about pursuing negotiations with Hitler after the 1st of September 1939? Nobody really. And this is where we are today. Europe must arm and stick together. And strangely, it seems to be easier to stick together than ever with pro-Putin people like Milos Zeman and Viktor Orban now swiftly distancing themselves from. We have a new world. You can say that the post-Cold world ended, post-Cold War world ended on the 24th of February, and it's not likely to come back.
Indeed. No, I think that's absolutely true. History has changed, and the type of Europe that is going to exit this war is going to be a different one than entered it. Anders, I'm soon going to come back to you on what you just mentioned a little bit concerning Sweden and Finland, a few other consequences that may arise because of this. But let's talk a little bit first about the risk that this war is going to spill over to Europe more than it has done already. I mean, this is something which comes up very often in discussions right now, and of course with implicit threats of using nuclear weapons by Medvedev and other Russians. Of course, that has scared a lot of Europeans to think that if we continue with our economic escalation, the risk is that we're going to be dragged into this war. Tengiz, I mean, you have been on the front line of a war with Russia for a very, very, very long time. Are you expecting Georgia to become sort of a place for a hot war again if Putin is successful in Ukraine and he will move from there to be even more aggressive against other countries in the Black Sea region?
There is no doubt about that. If Putin succeeds in Ukraine, the next target, immediate target, will be Georgia and Moldova, and then Baltics and others. Because, I mean, you know, Russians, Kremlin officials, are always very outspoken about their ambitions. And listening Mr. Putin's interpretation of human history, when he said that Ukraine was created by Lenin, he also said that nations like Ukraine or Georgia or Belarus or even Baltic states and others, they have no right to exist. And then Mr. Lavrov, who by the way today had a press conference just 1 hour before we started, he was still very cynical. And they were very blunt and outspoken that they consider sphere of influence at least the territory which was under influence of Soviet Union. So, which cover much wider territory than Georgia or Moldova or Ukraine. And of course, definitely, yes, absorbing Ukraine, Russia will be much stronger. And if today we are talking and discussing how to stop Russia, tomorrow, if Russia absorbs Ukraine, that will be almost impossible because Russia will be much stronger, much confident, and that just encourages Russia, because any kind of rational approach towards Russia, Putin takes as an advantage. And I will give you examples. Before the launching military aggression in Ukraine, he convinced President Macron and Chancellor Scholz that Russia has no intention to start large-scale operation, and immediately has broken his word, because as soon as he see that there is kind of internal discussion, internal misunderstandings and diversity among European allies or NATO allies, he immediately takes that as an advantage. In 2008, when NATO Bucharest summit failed to grant membership action plan to Georgia and Ukraine, Putin took this as a sign that now is the time to act against those countries. And the problem is that Russians, they gave 100,000 reasons why they are doing so, but the real reason is different. It's really mockery of international law what Mr. Putin or Lavrov are talking about. I mean, this manipulation with terms like undivided security and basic principles of OSCE. Because if somebody violates those principles, it's Russia. And it's very interesting that Mr. Lavrov recalled the Istanbul OSCE summit decision, Istanbul OSCE summit of 1999, which it was really historical summit because Russia took the obligation to fully withdraw from Georgia and from Moldova. And those obligations are still unfulfilled. And the reality is that Russia is fighting for spheres of influence, because I don't think that either Mr. Putin or any other in the Kremlin are really thinking that NATO is the threat. Because just look in recent history, before the sanctions of 2014, Russia had brilliant cooperation, very fruitful cooperation with NATO countries, including military cooperation. So complications start just only after 2014. So the problem is that NATO prevents Russia to act brutally in countries like Moldova, like Georgia, like Ukraine. Therefore, he is talking about threats from NATO. And of course, if he succeeds in Ukraine, the next step will be Georgia, which is, that 20% of Georgia's territory is still occupied, Moldova, and new aggression about the European security. So that's why I said in the beginning of our webinar that this is not only about Ukraine. This is about the Europe, about the future, about our prosperity. I understand that those sanctions are also painful for EU taxpayers, definitely, because so many European business people, they had direct business with Russia, and of course they are suffering. But we should consider this as an investment in our future. And by the way, pay more attention to countries like Georgia, like Ukraine, Black Sea region, because Black Sea region, this is part of the Europe. And it plays significant role in prosperity of Europe, because the whole Black Sea, it's about connectivity of markets, access markets from Europe to Asia, energy resources, transportation of Caspian resources to Europe, and so on. So that's why those countries pay attention to Ukraine or Georgia and other countries. It's not just a, let's say, just pocket of problem, but this is investment in the prosperity of Europe, freedom of Europe, peace in Europe. And I think peace is worth it to pay for.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much, Tengiz. Anders?
Yeah, if I may follow up on what Tengiz said, I think this is very important. NATO is not an issue. It's not Russia's security. It's Russia's aggressive ambitions. And then it's the question, you have two elements here. Is it the sphere of influence, or is it simply Putin is afraid of democracy in his neighborhood? Both are correct, but the question is how much we should put pressure on it. I think that democracy is the big threat, and therefore Putin wants to keep the area down. And what he has developed now is Belarus, wonderful, an obedient president who only sits there because of Putin. Kazakhstan, Tokayev, looks similar, but he's still too independent for Putin's taste, and he wants somebody like that in Ukraine. I'm convinced that Viktor Medvedchuk is his candidate to become a puppet president in Ukraine, and then he wants to continue, as Tengiz said. I would put Moldova first on the list because Moldova is weaker than Georgia, so it's easier to take Moldova. But there's no reason to stop within the former Soviet Union. This is a war, civilization war. It's a war on Europe and on the West, on democracy, and therefore we all have to stand up for Ukraine today. Sorry.
Oh, thank you indeed, Anders. And I mean, that's also a very good segue into what I was going to ask you. So I think there is a growing realization that if not NATO, so at least Europe is already involuntarily becoming part of this war. I mean, we are supplying Ukraine with military capabilities. I would strongly advise us to do that even more. The more the war is going to move towards Western Ukraine, the closer it's going to get to Europe, and the more visible the slaughter and the human sacrifice, human cost of this war in Ukraine is going to become to Europeans as well. As you said, Russia is, I mean, Belarus is now obviously sort of a puppet state of Russia, and Russia is going to have military capacity just a few kilometers southeast of Vilnius. Russia has already made its intention clear of not just expanding its control of its previous controlled region, basically the notion of the Ruski Mir. It's threatening Sweden and Finland, and of course will ramp this up in different ways through cyber attacks, information wars, more violations of other countries' airspaces, more threats about using nuclear power as part of this war, the more it drags out. That would be my expectation of what's going to happen. And I don't really see sort of a scenario here when we can stay out of this war, and see a scenario when we're not going to get sort of dragged into it in a much more immediate and direct way than we are right now. What would you say about that, Anders?
Well, I completely agree. There are so many ways in which the West can be drawn into the war. For example, the Russians a few days ago bombed a Romanian ship in the Black Sea. That's essentially an act of war. The Russians have closed all of the Ukrainian ports through a sea blockade. That's an act of war. And Turkey has now closed the Bosphorus to Russian naval ships in line with the Montreal Convention of 1936. So this is completely legal, but will the Russians accept it? So there are many tensions. And then, of course, we have in the air. Now, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Poland are giving 70 fighter planes of old Soviet type to Ukraine. How are they delivered? Ukrainian pilots come to these countries and fly them back. Will the Russians do this without trying to do anything about them? Not very likely. So, and where will they be hit? Perhaps over those countries. That would be acts of war. And we can also see other problems with overflights, and that results in airplanes being shot down. Of course, Poland, with its very long border to Ukraine, is the most exposed, but all of these countries are exposed. They are for EU and NATO countries that are bordering on Ukraine. So we have lots of very dangerous contact points, and the Russians show no hesitation to use serious violence. And coming back to Sweden and Finland, it's obvious that we are in a very severe situation now. And then you want to have many friends. Both Finland and Sweden have tried to have bilateral agreements, strategic agreements with the United States. And with a president like Donald Trump, that was not much of a sense of a guarantee. So I think that Swedes and Finns increasingly realize that we have to join NATO, and the earlier the better. And of course, this means that NATO has got a renaissance, and the EU is finally getting a security and defense foreign policy. So we are seeing big changes, and it has to be because Putin's threat is to civilization, to democracy, to Europe, and it's also to us. It's no reason to believe that it's limited to the former Soviet Union.
And Anders, do you see the Biden administration being prepared for a serious ramp up of this conflict, which is also going to include NATO?
I would say that the dominant idea now in Washington, expressed both by President Biden and Secretary Blinken, is NATO and the US must not get involved. And I think it was very clever of Josep Borrell to make this EU action to deliver these fighter planes to Ukraine, because the Americans think that they have information that Putin is completely bloody-minded, and that he will double down, and that he's completely paranoid, and therefore they must not arouse any suspicion. That explains President Biden's many statements that NATO and the US will not be involved. They really think that the Russians don't believe them, since Putin never says anything that is true. They don't think that Biden says anything that is true either. And the Americans simply don't know how to communicate with Putin because of these serious problems with veracity. So I think that there is a great risk of more countries being involved, and I think that Turkey is likely to come in the first place, both because they have such a strong position against Russia, so that they are not going to give in easily. And of course, the Turkish drones is the big success in the war materials recently, while the Russian answer is these terrible thermal bombs that they used in Syria that burn off a square kilometer instantly.
Tengiz, taking the wider Black Sea region view here, Anders just mentioned Turkey, and that Turkey has taken firm positions, of course, depending on its own problems with Russia for a while. How are other countries in the region positioning themselves? What are they expecting?
Thank you. if we are talking about literal states, so literal states position is quite obvious, because three of them are NATO members and fully sharing concerns and are sharing solidarity towards Ukraine. And even Turkey's recent decision about Montreux Convention and Turkish support to Ukraine is really essential, including military support. When it comes to Georgia, I think situation is more unclear, because we share same destiny with Ukraine, and I would say that even ordinary people in Georgia, they try to do their best to support Ukraine, and I mean there are individual contributors as well. When it comes to the wider region, we should look at the geopolitics as well, because we have Azerbaijan, by the way, which is essential for the East-West cooperation, and Azerbaijan plays significant role in energy transportation and so on. And it was very noble step from the President Aliyev when he said that Sokar gas stations will supply emergency services in Ukraine without any charges. We have Armenia, which is the member of CSTO. So why I am highlighted this, that those countries are in under very serious pressure. I do believe that the people in Armenia or in Central Asian countries and so on, they are together with the Ukrainians. But the first of all, the question is, do they have the real information about what's going on, and what is their capabilities for the action? Because be in the military bloc with Russia, it's extremely dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. And just yesterday, there were voting in General Assembly of the United Nations, and we see that countries which are under pressure by Russia, they were either were against, or just they showed empty seats at the General Assembly. So therefore, and each of them understand that they are under very serious threat. And talking about region, we should bear in mind that this is another ongoing frozen conflict in the region. This is in Karabakh, which is not solved, and Russia is there, and Russian troops are in both sides, in Armenian soil and in Azerbaijan soil. And what does it mean to have Russian peacekeeper? Ask Georgians, ask Moldovans. That's extremely dangerous for the national security and those countries' sovereignty. That's very important that you mentioned Belarus, because while we're speaking about Ukraine, and while we are speaking about the ongoing and possible threats for Georgia or Moldova or any other countries, Belarus is already absorbed and annexed by Russia. And that's a very, very dangerous reality. That's why I think that the main point is that we need not just solution for Ukraine, but we need unanimous voice and unified approach towards the Russia's politics of sphere of privileged interests. How to stop war in Ukraine, this is the immediate task. But how to stop Russia's policy of spheres of privileged interest, spheres of influence, and how to prevent such kind of actions in other countries, that's an issue which we have to pay more attention.
All right, finally, I'm going to ask you, Anders. There has been a lot of talk, of course, a lot of commentary over the past couple of weeks concerning different scenarios for regime change in Russia, whether there is internal political battles going on between competing factions, or if Putin basically controlled the entire machinery, and as long as he can keep himself alive by his own means or by the help of others, he is going to remain in power. So, Anders, are there any scenarios that you think are likely when there's going to be so many pressures building up in Moscow and in wider Russia that this current regime is going to be toppled?
Basically, I think that the policy of the West now should be that Putin has to go. It was said about Assad that he has to go. Putin today is hardly better than Assad. Well, of course, Assad has killed many more people than Putin, but they are in similar situations. Perhaps one doesn't say so aloud if one is a leading politician, but probably not very wise. I can say so because I'm an independent person. But if we look upon it in various perspectives, the Russo-Japanese War led to the revolution of 1905. The World War I led to the Russian Revolution of 1917, but Stalin's massive massacres didn't cause any particular upset for him. Khrushchev was ousted by the Politburo in October 1964. The Politburo tried to oust Gorbachev in August 91. They failed and they lost it themselves. Traditionally, you have three ways of breaking a regime. Wars that are lost abroad, leading to massive popular dissatisfaction. And then finally, a coup at the top. The Politburo today is called the Security Council. It has 13 members. 4 of them are old KGB generals from St. Petersburg, Putin's old colleagues, but they were all more successful in the KGB than Putin. And it's noticeable that they have all remained there. There are very few changes in the composition of the Security Council, and the new additions are not strengthening. So if Putin is to be ousted, I think it will be these 4 KGB generals who do the job, that they gang up with some other people in the Security Council. The Security Council meets about every 10th day. Putin is always chairing the meeting. They don't take place otherwise. This would be the place to change it. We know extremely little about what is happening in the Kremlin today, and you see some reports about it. I would not trust them at all, because I think that this is entirely based on disinformation. Approximately, as we learned once upon a time, because that Yuri Andropov was a liberal because he drank whiskey. This kind of information should not be taken seriously. So whenever I see a report discussing the factions in the Kremlin, check, do they have any sources? No. There's one form of sources that makes sense, and that's the old Kremlinological way of checking who is present where, and the other Kremlinological way, check what they actually say in the speeches. And Nikolai Patrushev and Sergei Narishkin are people who make a lot of speeches, and whom we can identify what views they have. But most of the people there actually don't make this kind of speeches or articles so that they can be properly identified. So we know, in fact, less about what's happening inside the Kremlin today than we did in the Soviet Union.
All right, thank you so very much, Anders, and thank you to you, Tengiz. Also, thank you to Elizabeth, who you may have noticed, she joined us for a few minutes until she realized that she had mixed up times between Central European time and GMT time. So she couldn't participate, alas, but hopefully she's going to be able to join us next week. It's been a great pleasure talking to both of you. The point with these events are to try to make us a little bit more clever and understand what possible scenarios going forward are going to look like. And I, for one, will leave this event in a much more informed state than I were when I joined it. And I hope also you in the audience think so. Thank you so much, Anders and Tengiz, and till next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.